Welcome to Season 4 of The Future Of, where we explore the most important topics shaping our world today. I'm Azam Faruqi, and both Vasi and I are excited to be back with brand new episodes that are both insightful and entertaining. Thanks to your support, our podcast has grown from strength to strength over the past 3 seasons. This season, we're pushing the boundaries even further with cutting-edge content that's both timely and thought-provoking. Whether you're a loyal listener or a newcomer, you're in for a treat. We've got a fantastic lineup of topics this season. You can also check out some of our most popular episodes like The Future of Capitalism, Photography, Liberalism, Space Exploration, Innovation, Gaming, and Climate Change. Join us as we explore the ideas and trends that are shaping our world. And as always, you can reach out to us at futureof19@gmail.com with feedback and suggestions. So sit back, relax, and get ready for an incredible season of The Future Of. Our first episode is all about the future of democratic capitalism with Martin Wolf.
I see it. Excellent. Hello, and thank you, everybody. Today, we have a very special guest as we are honored to be speaking to Martin Wolf on the future of capitalism. Mr. Wolf is an associate editor and chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, and he's regarded as one of the most important economics commentators globally. He has a long and impressive background in economics, starting off his career at the World Bank. He was a member of the UK government's Independent Commission on Banking. He was also the director of studies at the Trade Policy Research in London in the UK. And he's also advised many governments and international organizations on trade and economic integration. In 2000, he was awarded the OBE for services rendered to financial journalism. And on top of this, he's also a well-noted and published author of several books. And recently, he released his new book entitled The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. Thank you, Mr. Wolf, and welcome. And why don't we start, Azam? Why don't we kick it off?
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Wolf. The first, how we want to start off is for the benefit of our viewers and listeners. Can you start by defining what do you mean by democratic capitalism and what's its relationship with liberal democracy?
Well, democratic capitalism is actually the conflation of the two. So it's a liberal democracy, which is the political system, and market capitalism, which is the economic system. And so you put the two together, you get democratic capitalism. So let me just explain the two bits, and I'll start with liberal democracy, so comes first. Though actually historically it came second. So liberal democracy is a system of governance with wide, ideally universal suffrage for all adult citizens within a country. What makes it liberal is that it is built around protection, obviously, of the right to vote itself. That's obviously central. The legitimacy of the outcome of votes, that is, it's accepted that whoever has the most votes has won. Of course, there are many complex rules around that, but there are a set of rules which everybody understands and regards as fair enough for deciding that civil and political rights are protected. And that means that there is a rule of law which binds all citizens and the government, so the state is subject to the law, and this also protects individual liberties, which are central to such a polity. And of course, now we get to the other part, central to the economy, which also requires the rule of law. So it's a common theme of both the polity, as I've defined it, and of the economic system. This is because the defining characteristic of what I mean by market capitalism is competition, which means entry into the market. So the economically powerful cannot prevent new entrants, nor that can they create cartels and other devices to keep them out. That enshrines the principle of competition. And that means, in turn, that individual and collective efforts of various kinds to compete in the market, produce goods and services people want, are themselves legitimate and desirable in the long run, other basis of prosperity. And these are mutually supportive systems, I argue in my book, in that they are both based on some very fundamental shared values in individual rights, pretty obviously, which are protected against the state and the powerful. They mean in both cases that we don't have a society based on ascribed status, and everybody somehow is protected in different ways by the legal system that binds both of these two aspects of our society. One way you can think about this is that what we are trying to do, which is really historically almost unheard of and very difficult, as we're now finding, is to separate wealth from power. That is to say, the political system gives power to those who win the most votes in the political struggle, and the economic system rewards people with wealth on how successful they are in that, but that wealth cannot and must not be allowed to buy power and use it against the rest of society. And of course, historically, I'll end with that, and in many parts of the world today, this separation between wealth and power has not existed or does not exist now, which means essentially that both power and wealth are combined in one group of people. Oligarchy, plutocracy, perhaps is a word for this. Sometimes it ends up in autocracy, with the autocrat in charge essentially controlling all the wealth of the society and all essentially the people in it as well. And those societies, I argue, cannot be effectively properly capitalists. They are inevitably going to have distorted competition, crony capitalism, and all the rest of it, lawless capitalism, and of course they can't be democratic by definition.
Perfect. So you see this relationship as a symbiotic relationship, right? In the book, you've also acknowledged that it's a very fragile relationship. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Well, it is worth noting that historically there have been a few attempts at more or less democratic regimes. There have never been democratic regimes in our sense before, that is to say, genuine universal adult suffrage. I mean, if you think about one of the most famous cases in European history, that of ancient Athens, the suffrage was limited to men, as has pretty well always been the case. And of course, slaves were excluded, and there were a lot of foreigners too. So the number of citizens was limited. So, but there have been attempts to do something like this before in organized, relatively sophisticated societies. But the last 200 years, particularly the last 100 years or so, it's been the first time in human history that we've had large numbers of countries and large proportion of humanity living in democratic societies in which the processes I've defined earlier have existed. They're all, to a greater or less extent, capitalist societies. They've always had a strong market element within them, but not all market capitalist societies are democratic in this sense. I don't know how you define China, but it clearly has market capitalist elements, very important ones, and it's clearly not democratic. And there are many, many countries around the world where autocracy has replaced democracy, and they still have at least some characteristics, though often very distorted characteristics, of a market economy. What makes it fragile is there are two basic dangers, or they're interrelated. The economy can, over time, become increasingly plutocratic. Monopoly power can become increasingly powerful. There can be the use of the resources that corporations and individuals gain from successful market competition or other means to subvert the political process, essentially to buy politics. And in that case, democracy disappears. It becomes a plutocracy. One of the best examples of that historically, though I don't wish to oversimplify the story, but was late Renaissance Florence, which was a very dynamic, of course, again, very limited suffrage republic, but the Medici, who gained immense wealth from banking, essentially bought the state and made themselves absolute rulers. So that's one way it can go. The other alternative, which Plato actually discusses in his Republic, interesting point that I stress in my book, is that as the plutocracy comes to be seen by most citizens as oppressive and overpowerful, they seek some sort of tribune of the people, if you like, some populist leader who will defend them against the such people. And this person will demand absolute power in return for the defense he provides. And such people end up as what the Greeks called tyrants. The tyrants in Greece didn't last on the whole, but that's the other danger. You end up with an autocrat. These are the sources of fragility, the relationship between this diffused and equally shared power of the demos, the people, and the concentrated wealth and financial and economic power of the plutocracy, the aristocracy, whatever you call it. This relationship breaks down and you end up with a plutocracy or autocracy or a mixture of both.
Yeah. So, Mr. Wolf, I guess fast forward, we're in the context of a pandemic. It completely disrupts the world. I was wondering, without COVID-19 and what's happened over the last couple of years, do you believe the acceleration of economic inequality would have still happened? Or do you think the pandemic really sort of exposed it or just merely accelerated that process? So we see that even more so than we would have maybe 3 years ago.
My inclination at the moment is to think that the impact of COVID-19 upon our society was rather smaller than one might have expected. This is a puzzle. It certainly wasn't obvious to me. What is it now? 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, that's how it would end up. It clearly was a shock, but because we had these very successful vaccines emerge very quickly, it was a relatively brief shock, briefer than we might have expected. And the disruption it caused went on into the future with the post-COVID supply chain disruptions, which we know. Nonetheless, if we hadn't had the war in Ukraine, I think by now we would have sort of pretty well got over it. Now, it's clear that the response, above all, of central banks was it was a huge turn of the monetary levers. And the aim, of course, was to support financial markets. And it added a bit, but not that much, to what had already been very, very powerful bull markets. And that increased inequality of wealth a bit. But the trends on that are, as I discuss in my book, far longer lasting. They're much more structural. And I would argue the events leading up to the financial crisis and what followed that, the global financial crisis, were vastly more important in these dimensions than COVID has been. So I don't think right now that the concerns one would have had about rising inequality in many countries of incomes and rising inequalities of wealth, which are more obvious still, have been in any way fundamentally changed by COVID. The way there was an effect during it pretty obviously that people could stay at home and work at home, as people like us could, I imagine, certainly I could, were protected from the illness, could live pretty normal lives apart from going to the office and going out. And of course, the people who work face to face lost their jobs and their incomes or had to work with substantial risk. That was an important inequality, a different sort of inequality. But interestingly, among the people who face that risk more than, well, not among the people who face that risk more than anybody else were medical staff, including very highly trained doctors and very highly paid ones. So it wasn't a simple case of inequality either.
So talking about the great financial crisis, you just mentioned that had a much greater impact. And while reading your book, it's not that you don't argue that cultural and other factors like migration may have not played a part in the rise of populism or the polarization that we see today, but a somewhat functioning economy keeps a lid on those things. And with the great financial crisis, all bets were off. That really cascaded and acted as a catalyst, right? And this is one of the underappreciated fallout. I mean, I shouldn't say underappreciated, but the unintended outcomes, I should say, of the great financial crisis is how it led to the rise of populism. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, the way I've thought about this, and in writing this book, though my views change over time, is that it's obvious that over the last 50 years or so, 60 years, there have been huge cultural changes in our societies, and these have been very unsettling for many people. And they're multidimensional, and it's pretty obvious. I don't really need to stress what they are and their impact. But I argue, in addition to that, and this was before the financial crisis, two other things happened. First, there were some very fundamental changes in, this is almost Marx, in the means of production, which was essentially we shifted from a manufacturing economy in terms of employment to a service economy. And this changed the status, quite particular economic status, of the dominant factory workers, who used to be a gigantic proportion of our labor forces. It was close to half our labor force was employed in manufacturing in the UK after the Second World War. And this was overwhelmingly male, and overwhelmingly people who'd left school early. They were not university educated people. Because there were so many, because the factories were so important, because the trades unions they belonged to were so influential in the workplace and could organize the workplace well, they were really socially very powerful. And the political parties they supported, like the Labour Party and the Democrats and the Social Democrats in Germany, so were very, very powerful too. That was declining consistently throughout the last 40, 50 years. At the same time, a new class was emerging whose implications, I think, have only begun fully to understand in the last 10 years or so, which is, let's put it crudely, people like us, people who've been to university. But back when I went to university, in my country, for example, it was 5% of the population. Now it's close to half. It's a complete transformation. So the younger generation today has a completely different social and intellectual makeup from any previous generations in societies like ours before. And the rift between them culturally and the old working class in decline is an immensely important background cultural fact, which is both economic and social and cultural. And I think that shapes what's happened. Now, in addition to that, so that was the first big lot, there's a capitalism bit, which is capitalism itself changed because it was deregulated. liberalized. It became more financially driven, more global, more influenced by a new sector, the high-tech sector, the technology sector, which has very powerful natural monopoly characteristics. And in addition, an erosion of competition policy went along. And this created what I refer to as a burgeoning financially based rentier capitalism, if you like. Rigged capitalism is a more loaded way of putting it. Now, these things together created some very powerful trends, which we've already discussed in terms of income distribution and wealth distribution.
Yep.
And it created one specific problem, which was very profound, which is the distribution of income shifting in this way. There's a lot of very good work on this, tended to weaken domestic demand because demand shifted to high saving people. But the world as a whole wanted to provide savings, particularly to the US and UK, a few other developed countries, because they found the export-led growth model, I won't go into detail, too comfortable. And the result was to sustain demand. This is the theme of my previous book, The Shifts and the Shock. The sustained demand in our countries, Raghuram Rajan of Chicago University made the same point earlier, we had to drive a colossally powerful credit engine. Basically, we pushed everybody who could borrow into borrowing, and we did so by pushing up house prices and leveraging up the purchase of houses through an explosion of credit. This blew up in the financial crisis. That's the key point of the financial crisis, in my view. And when it blew up, that engine stopped. And it's why we've had to have these incredibly aggressive monetary policies since. But the financial crisis, so we already had all this territory which was troubled long before it was accumulating over decades. It's just that most of us, including certainly me, didn't realize how troubled it was becoming. And then the financial crisis hit, and that had two dramatic results. One was the financial system was rescued by the state. The banks that were clearly at the center of all this were rescued by the state. Not everybody kept their jobs, but most people did. Meanwhile, the financial crisis fell with tremendous force on many of the most vulnerable in our societies. And they decided, perfectly understandably, that these people were both the people running their economies and financial systems were both incompetent and corrupt, and they rigged the system for their benefit and then rigged the system to save themselves. And this was absolutely intolerable and unjust, and it led them to repudiate the old establishment. And the most interesting thing to me, which I wouldn't have predicted, is the establishment they repudiated most is the old conservative establishment, because that was the one that was associated with the sorts of people who were saved, which they didn't like. They didn't want to support the left because they associated them with a lot of the most feckless people in their society. So they were looking for leaders who could confirm their values and their value, but not in any way represent the old conservative hierarchies. And that's where Donald Trump came in.
Right.
So it's a perfect expression of that. And because Britain is completely different, but you see the same effect with Boris Johnson, except that it was his cause, which was nationalism. The national assertion became a part of this. Now, this is a very long story, but nonetheless a very, very summary version of my story about how we got where we are in a society in which a very large proportion of the population, and particularly the old working class, if you like, depending on what they do, but the old working class are deeply disenchanted with politics as they are and are looking for the sort of leaders I referred to earlier.
And Mr. Wolf, I just wanted to maybe probe. You mentioned when you were explaining everything that you didn't see a lot of this coming, and a lot of us didn't see this coming. Could we answer the question why that is?
I think well, I think it's very, very difficult to see cracks that are emerging underneath what seems a perfectly stable system. And it takes great perceptiveness, which certainly at that stage I lacked. Now, there are two aspects of this failure in a way. The most important for me is that the general failure of economists to understand that the economic system itself was becoming very fragile. Now, see, I look back, and I wrote about this in my last book. I knew that this system I've described was unstable. But what I didn't realize is that it would take down the banking system. I thought we would, as many economists did, we were going to have a huge foreign currency crisis at the end when markets corrected, a big collapse of the dollar because it had been overbought, and the current account deficit the US running were obviously unsustainable. What I didn't realize, though I wrote a little bit about it, is that the debt that had been accumulated in the private sector, particularly the household sector, to support the huge consumption boom, which itself was based off the housing boom, would prove not only unsustainable, but that when the reversal happened, it would end up bringing down the banking sector in a panic. And there's a huge question whether that was inevitable. So we can debate that. But anyway, we didn't, with very few exceptions, I can think of two really among reputable economists, Raghuram Rajan, who I mentioned, and Noura Rabini, that this scale of crisis would happen. Now, the second thing we missed is that, which is, I think, to a significant extent independent, is that the long sort of boom of the post-Reagan, the Reagan-Thatcher and subsequent economies liberalization, market liberalization, generally the economy seemed to be working well. We got the Clinton boom that was disrupted, of course, by the crash in 2000, but then the economy started growing again, not quite as fast, but still pretty well. And we had what seemed to be very strong productivity growth in the UK, and European economies were generally doing well. What we didn't realize is that these massive social and structural shifts against the middle class, if you like, what had been after the Second World War, our new middle class, the middle class of the industrial working class with high wages, who, for the first time in history, people like this could enjoy really quite a high standard of living and a very fair degree of economic security. But that the changes which were occurring, deindustrialization, the shift in manufacturing abroad, the shift to this much more unstable service sector as the place for them to get work, the rise of what's sometimes called the precariat, which I refer to, that all this was shaking their confidence cumulatively in our political system and our political leaders, and they felt increasingly alienated from both the political system and our political leaders. And as again, though I don't emphasize this, I think, enough in the book, this was reinforced by these very profound cultural shifts that were also moving from their point of view against them. And I don't think, I think really very, very few people, there were a few, but very few joined all these dots together. And I think that's probably what usually happens. It's very difficult to understand in all the detail of how these things interact. And I wouldn't claim even now that I do.
So we can see a bit of a fork in terms of polarization from the great financial crisis. So one, we talked about the working class that felt that they got left behind. And over the years, reading different books, I mean, Fiona Hill wrote a book about her, part of it was She covered upbringing, and that was north of England, and how the town is today. We interviewed Professor Paul Collier a couple of years ago, and he gave similar examples. You gave example of Sheffield as a town, and we've seen that in U.S. as well. And Nick Kristof of New York Times wrote a really good book about the opioid crisis in Oregon that had to do with loss of jobs and deindustrialization. But the other side of the fork is maybe the generation that came out of the universities and educational institutions during the financial crisis. One of the economic theories is that if a generation loses or comes in the labor market during crisis, generally it's hard for them to make up over the lifetime earnings, right? They've already left behind. And you can probably see a lot of them gravitating more towards socialism, right? So we see a lot of support for Jeremy Corbyn in UK. We saw a lot of support for Bernie Sanders in the US. There were a lot of other socialist movements that gave rise to it as well. What are some of, so knowing that socialism, obviously for the new generation, they haven't experienced the full socialist view, let's say like the generations of the past, so they don't probably see the failures of that system. But what are some of the reforms that you think would work in bringing this polarization back more towards the middle? Because some of the reforms that you've talked about are what we would call those centrist reforms, right? Something what we're starting to see from Joe Biden a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about reforms and how do we bring these extremes more towards the center?
I think first of all, I think you're raising a very profound issue, which I feel I simply because I ran out of space and probably brain power too. But you're raising a very interesting question before I get to this about what's going on. Like many observers, I've been surprised when the financial crisis happened. I sort of thought this was bound to lead to a leftward shift because this is a failure of capitalism, isn't it? And politically, pretty well universally, it's led to a rightward shift. Sorry. Which also happened, as we remember, famously in the 1930s, with particularly in Germany. So, and Britain was conservative, though in that decade, America was somewhat different. But the real left, if you like, the revolutionary left or the radical left really didn't benefit very much from the Great Depression, and it certainly didn't benefit from the global financial crisis, not at all. Corbyn was there briefly, but he didn't really make much headway. I won't go into the 2017 election was a bit of a freak. So you're suggesting something very, very important, which is the people who would naturally be prone to that sort of view. We must overturn the system in a radical way rather than being radically reactionary, radically progressive, if you like. Were the young who had been anyway educated to think in these rather abstract terms. The working class was no longer the old working class that supported this sort of thing. They'd moved somewhere else for the reasons we discussed. And but the point about the young is that in most of our societies, because of our demographic structure, they're not as big a share of the population as they would normally have been. My generation, which is the baby boom generation, is a remarkably big generation relative to most of the subsequent ones. So the young aren't as weighty politically as you might expect. And in addition, many of them don't vote. So if you add those two things together, they haven't had the influence you might have thought they would. And the parties many of them have supported have lost the support to a remarkable degree of the working class people who used to support them. Now, yes. that is, in which case, what they've lost really offsets demographically more than offsets their gains. And we can see this dramatically in America and in Britain, but also in France and so forth. The Socialist Party, people who used to support the Socialist Party in France now vote for Marine Le Pen. Now, I've discussed some of the reasons, but that's very, very important. So what will happen as the old die off and the young get older is going to be very interesting to see, because in the end, the young, as I always say, there's never a real generational war. The young always wins until the people who are younger than them will defeat them, because in the end, the young always win. But so one possibility, which I think is very, very interesting, is that over time, since there is evidence that the radicalization of young people is not reversing as they get a bit older, that our societies are going to move away from where we are now with this very strong, angry right to a very strong, angry left. I think I wouldn't rule that out at all. I don't have any sense of where that will go, but it may be the voice of the future is, strangely enough, Bernie Sanders. Who's actually, by these standards, a perfectly reasonable person. You can get much worse, much worse. Now, so I don't know. Now, that leads us to what should be done now. I'm completely I'm not at all with the details of what Biden is doing, but I'm pretty clear about the broad wisdom of what he's trying to do. If you're going to make a democracy work, that's my core argument of my book. That was all a very long introduction to this, but it's important and it raises questions I don't really discuss properly in the book. So if you want to make a democracy work, you have to convince people that a large proportion of the population, you can never convince everyone, but a really large proportion of the population, that it's working for them, that it's giving them, broadly speaking, what they want, namely a reasonably prosperous life, reasonable security, opportunity for their families, and a feeling that they're valued and not being cheated. That seems to me essential, the sort of core values of a democracy. And I argue in my book that obviously cannot be achieved by doubling down on identity politics of any kind, because you can't compromise on people's identities. And if you fundamentally clash on how their values and identities work, it's a fundamental clash that is ineradicable. It's just a fundamental clash. So I think once you make that the dominant theme of politics, you get into the sort of strife you see in the US today, where people just can't talk to each other because they just don't share any language they can talk about. But so I think that it is reason that Biden understood that if he was going to bring the polity away from this, the paralysis of mutual rage, then he has to build something different, which says, I can try to give you all, young people who've been to university, working class people, I will give you all something to hope for. In the case of university graduates, it's obviously through forgiveness of student loans. I don't want to go into whether that's a good policy. It's controversial, but you can see what he's trying to do. And I think in this country here, the biggest issue is to get housing sorted out, because housing is unmanageably expensive. And by the way, that's true, I think, in many other countries too. So that's a policy a government should follow to bring people together, because everybody wants a decent house and the security in many countries of ownership. That's another thing. He's trying to bring back manufacturing jobs by emphasizing new factories to build batteries or whatever, just that we are trying to. And then there's that really important fallback, construction. I think he is right to, you get a huge infrastructure boom, you generate an enormous amount of construction jobs, which are incredibly important for working class people, particularly working class men who are, you go for things like childcare, which are very obviously incredibly important to a very large number of women who want to work and should work, but obviously have in practice the reality of this, alas, is still they're predominantly responsible for childcare. So you build a coalition which I think has to be manageably, financially manageable. I don't think they've done that perfectly at all. In fact, I think they've wasted a lot of resources on things they should never have wasted resources on in the early years. But particularly in 2000, but 2001. So but the 2021. Sorry, going through numbers in my head. So I think the attempt to bring people around a strategy of this kind, which is sort of what was done in America in the middle of the 20th century and in other European countries at the same time. Now, we probably need that sort of thing. Now, that's what a response you get. Will it work? To cool the temperatures, make people feel happier? Well, as the global financial crisis disappears, as we're brought together, unfortunately, by a new sort of Cold War, it's nothing like enemies, maybe it will work. I don't know. We really don't know, but I think it is worth trying.
I wanted to sort of expand upon that a bit. You talk about that coalition building, bringing people in, seeing things that reflect where they want to be, their aspirations, where they may want to be economically. Do you think that'll work for what I call the liberal elites, right? Because some of the things that you discussed in your book that we are able to make, economic progress on is things like taxation and wages and education. But I think sometimes, there's this perception that the liberal elites, while they support maybe a lot of these policies and issues, they don't necessarily walk the talk. There isn't a lot of movement to say, like, let's really make education equal. Let's really look at wage inequality and look at a living wage and so forth. Let's look at healthcare and how do we properly pay for it? Like, how do you think we bring in those, what I call, quote unquote, the liberal elites under that sort of tent or coalition that you speak of?
That's a very good question. And to some degree, I don't know the answer. The truth is, I know much more. So in doing this, I started on this book because I thought it was incredibly important as a topic, the future of democracy and its relationship to capitalism. And I didn't feel that what was out there was good enough. But I was well aware when I started, which is why the book took me so long to write, much longer than any previous book, that I was a neophyte in a lot of these areas. So I've had to turn myself into an amateur writer on politics and society, and I emphasize the amateurishness. So that's inevitable. I've spent my life thinking about aspects of economics. I haven't done that in the same way on this. So I don't know how this can or will play out. I really don't know. Now, you talk specifically about the liberal elite. There is a view, which I think is widely can be understood, that both the parties of the center left and the center right, if you like, or the people of the center left and center right, broadly speaking, who are basically the people who run our societies in different roles, agree essentially that they like the way things are and they don't want them to change very much. That's what they agree on, because why shouldn't they? They're the elites. And and on the whole, they are in positions of power and influence. And some of them of vast wealth, but many just of comfort, and they control in different ways, all the central institutions of society. And they don't want any of this to change. So there are two answers to this, I think. Whether that will work in any specific country, I don't know. One is, if there are political entrepreneurs who are more positive than Mr. Trump, as it were, who put forward programs that actually are popular with the great mass of the people who are not in the elite, obviously enough, then they should be able to win sizable majorities. And it's very interesting to me that clearly not in any way an FDR, but if you look at Biden is leading, is president because of Black Americans. I mean, essentially the representatives of Representative Clyburn, as I understand it, was absolutely central in giving him the nomination. Well, that's a very important interest group whose main interest isn't cultural. Its main interest is in better lives for Black people and by extension other people in similar economic conditions, of which there are of course many. And Biden represents that. He's not a representative of liberal elites in that way, although many of them can live with him. Now the question is, he's trying to be more radical. Will he get the support? And there, I think the answer might be, he's got enough. He's got enough to win. They did pretty well in the midterms. This might influence where the Republicans go. Again, it might push them away from the far right if they feel that somebody like Trump, 30% of the electorate adore him, but 30% isn't enough. So if they feel that, again, that might shift the politics to the center, it seems to me. And then the politics of the center becomes something like this. Well, at least I hope this is, that these elites will say to themselves, on the whole, it's better to live in a stable democracy where people are really reasonably content, where we can govern reasonably sensibly, and where we don't have this colossal ongoing cultural war of rage that I've discussed before. We don't want that, because this could lead to the presidency of somebody who will destroy our institutions. We can see that. It's obvious, and it will not be good for us. So I hope, probably very naively, but I hope that the people you describe or you delineate will say to themselves, the people I'm writing for, I suppose, is, it's fun to be who we are at the moment and posture in the ways we do, but it's not stable. We've been given a warning. Trump is a warning. And so it's what's coming out of the younger people that you discussed earlier. We've got to rebuild a system all these people believe in. Otherwise, we're going to be in terrible trouble. I hope that they will see a collective self-interest in being willing to pay more tax, on reintroduce policies that are clearly beneficial to society as a whole in a measured and sensible way. And I think if they don't, I'm a very bad prophet, but if they don't, they cannot be confident of where this will end up.
So in the interest of time, we have questions prepared. We can probably have you here for another couple of hours, Mr. Wolf, but how we'd like to end is, if you can talk in how optimist are you about this? How do you see the future of democratic capitalism? And also talk about it in light of, you ended the book, which I saw it as a very pretty cool ending, like about reimagining citizenship, because it sort of tries to, again, bring everything together to the center in a way that there are a lot of talking points that if you just look at it, there are a lot of progressives probably won't like it, but it's something that does appeal to people on the right. And similarly, there are ideas that would probably appeal more to the people on the left. So just reimagining citizenship, if you can just talk a little bit about that, and how do you see the future of democratic capitalism?
Yep.
So why am I optimistic? It fits with this. So first of all, I think the record shows that our system, for all its many defects and fragilities, and for the fact that it's obviously very recent because it's a byproduct of capitalism itself, the market economy itself, it's been more successful than any other system. And not just though it's important in generating a reasonably remarkable level of prosperity on average, huge distribution problems, but that people are on the whole free to express their opinions. Again, controversial point, but very much more than in Russia or China. They have a say in who governs them, and if they don't like who governs them, they can get rid of him or her, which again they can't do in most societies around the world. And this combination of economic progress for all the problems it creates with political freedom and political accountability is very, very attractive to people. And I think it remains so. And as we manage the system well, it should continue to retain the allegiance of our populations. And it is worth mentioning, this point is very, very banal, that of course, people from our countries aren't fleeing to emigrate to other countries. It's the other way around. So there's something that's been going right here, rather big time, isn't there?
Yes.
And so we must stress this. And, I don't think most people would say that there is any other sort of system out there that is obviously, in any obvious way, superior to what we have. Yes, the Chinese have done some remarkable things in progressing from extreme poverty, but China is not an attractive model, at least can't be to people in our society. So in that sense, I think we have the benefit of the best system, and we need to point this out, and we need to defend it, and we really need to defend it. And the second point, I hope, is that now that people have experienced the form of populist politics we've had, and they can look around the world at what it's doing on the left in, say, Mexico or Venezuela, or on the right in Turkey, or Brazil under Bolsonaro, they can see this approach to politics just doesn't work. And what's more, they've seen how the Trump and the Johnsons have messed up their societies and their economies, different ways, complex ways, but they have. So the optimistic view is we have the best system, and the alternatives we've seen have screwed up, and we can get back to behaving in a broadly sensible way. The financial crisis is dwindling in the past, provided nothing catastrophic happens again. We're going to emerge from this, and I hope we will have learned from it. And I hope my book will help people a little to learn from it. Now, this gets your citizenship thing, which comes to the end. Well, if democracy is to work, then the people who define that democracy are its citizens, people tied to a place or a country, loyal to its political institutions, understanding their value, even if they don't particularly like its outcome. And they must feel that the state, and this is part of the more controversial aspects of that the state of which they're citizens cares about them and cares for them and cares for all of them. And that's but also they have obligations to it. And particularly if they're the most successful of the citizens, that is to say, citizens have obligations to one another. And that means, by definition, that the people with the largest resources and the largest capacities owe the most, because they can give the most. But I'm not saying it's only for them. So I do think we can restore what we have and defend it if we understand that the core idea of a democracy is that we do all share one thing. That is to say, the citizenship of our country, which is not the only thing in the world by any means. We have responsibilities, important ones worldwide. We have interests worldwide. I discussed that at length. But at the same time, this mutual dependence and trust in one another as citizens is a necessary condition for the political version of the good life. And I think that's what is at stake, and that's why I wrote this book.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. Just to wrap up, we typically ask our guests two fun questions. One is there a book besides yours that you have currently read within the last year that you would recommend to our listeners? And is there a show or a TV series that you would also recommend for fun?
Oh, well, the first one I think is fairly straightforward in that period, and that's Brad DeLong's Slouching Towards Utopia. Brad DeLong is professor at Berkeley. It's a very long book, but I think it's a wonderful history of that successful period, mostly American, but not uniquely so, and how liberal democracy triumphed and sort of threw it away. But I think it's an exceptional work. It's a labor of love. Now, TV shows. That's well, I suppose it has to be one that the North American audience would share. Probably the one I most enjoy. I don't watch that much, but the one I most enjoyed, and I can't remember its title, alas, is the one that showed the young female chess prodigy who became. Do you remember the name?
The Queen's Gambit.
I thought
that was fantastic. Yeah.
Beautifully done, beautifully acted, and for somebody of my generation who remembers. I wasn't in Russia at that time, though my wife actually was in the 60s. Obviously, slightly before we met, but not much. But anyway, it was so redolent of the Cold War as well, of the atmosphere. I thought it was quite superbly done. So I think of the series I've seen, I think it was a Netflix series, wasn't it?
Yes.
I thought it was the most thrilling. But I'm really an opera person rather than a television person.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
I hope this was interesting. I enjoyed it very, very much. You asked a lot of very difficult to answer questions, which are fundamental ones.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Just so our listeners know, the book is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. You can also follow Mr. Wolf on Twitter, and you could read all of his articles on the Financial Times. Thank you once again, and we very much enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.